Shalom and welcome to the Israel Policy Pod. I'm Neri Zilber, a journalist based in Tel Aviv and a policy advisor to Israel Policy Forum. Well, it happened, and don't say you weren't warned. As our avid listeners and watchers know, we here on the Israel Policy Pod took the threat of another war with Iran very, very seriously throughout January and February as tensions mounted and President Donald Trump streamed more and more forces to the Middle East. So now that we're firmly in the war's second week, our good friend Yaakov Lappin, a military and strategic affairs analyst and a veteran defense correspondent here in Israel, will be joining us to make sense of what has happened so far and what may yet happen. It was a terrific conversation as always with Yaakov, with a little surprise at the end for all of us. So without further ado, because sleep and time are very precious commodities in these parts these days, let's get into it. Hi, Yaakov. Welcome back to the podcast.
Good to be with you, Neri, as always.
The first question, and it's a question not just on podcasts, but to every Israeli these days. How are you doing? How's the family? We had a rough night last night in central and also northern Israel. A lot of sirens, but thankfully no real impacts or injuries. But how are you guys doing so far?
It kind of reminds me of the first and second and also the third lockdowns of coronavirus, but with the added privilege, quote unquote, of sirens and hearing the thud of the interception. I think that, for those people who have not yet heard what it sounds like when a missile interceptor over your head smashes into a 1-ton warhead, the thud that reverberates, and everybody who lives in this country will know what that means. I think you can really sort of divide people into those who have experienced that and those who haven't, because that's when you realize at the most intrinsic level, at your cellular level, that there's a regime that's trying to sow death and destruction in your very neighborhood. It almost makes it personal. And yet we all seem to have gotten used to it, Neri. I don't know about you, but it seems that, society is obviously struggling with these disruptions in the middle of the night, but there's a resilience. There's a sort of routine. So that's why it reminds me, the beginning of this war really reminded me of the first lockdown. From the pandemic, everybody was literally locked down. Everything was shut down. And then in the space of a few days, we were already in a different reality. Things were opening up, and people were taking
here in Israel during the war, not during the COVID lockdown, which
I'm only describing. I'm just doing the sort of. It reminded me of sort of the 3 coronavirus lockdowns, but in the space of a week. You know what I mean? Every phase of the past week was less and less restrictive. Until we got to a point where technically most things are open now and there is traffic in the streets, but we're still advised that you can't get more than 50 people. The Home Front Command has sort of put us in this middle ground. So it's a strange situation, and it reminds me of the in-between situations of, past emergencies and restrictions.
Yeah, and we'll definitely get into what the mood and also the politics are like here on the Israel front. But yeah, you're right, Yaakov. This is... Israelis can get used to anything, I suppose. So everyone here is living from one alert on their phone to the next, one siren to the next, and then trying to conduct semi-normal life in between, right. Which isn't normal at all, but this is our reality. And I thought in the beginning when you started your answer that you were going to go, this reminds me of the first, second, and third war of the past 2.5 years, whether it's from Gaza or Lebanon or the Houthis in Yemen or the exchanges with Iran in the war last year, but no, this is kind of a continuous of that continuity.
Exactly.
2.5 years. So just for our listeners and viewers, we're recording this lunchtime Wednesday, Tel Aviv time, just in case anything happens between now and when this episode goes up. This is day 12 of the war. So maybe an auspicious day, maybe not, but it's fair to say, at least from my opinion, the war is not going to end today or tomorrow. So we'll likely go beyond the duration of last year's 12-day war. But what I wanted to do with our time this week, Yaakov, is to really kind of make order and make some sense of what's been happening and what may still happen on all the various fronts and trust me, there are a lot of fronts to go through. But before we tack back to Israel, I wanted to start with the most obvious front and the target of the joint U.S. and Israeli offensive, Iran. So this started Saturday morning, February 28th. Operation Epic Fury, as the Americans call it, Operation Roaring Lion, as the IDF has called it. Big picture, most basic question to you, Yaakov. Like we said, 12 days in, how do you think the war has been going?
I think that this is a very big, clear example of a war that's based first and foremost on military capability removal of the enemy, which is a process that is the fundamental goal of this war as far as Israel is concerned, as far as the IDF is concerned, the military echelon. And it's a process that is not very visible. So we're getting all these big strategic discussions. What is victory? What will victory look like? But when you talk to IDF officials, and you've been hearing from many of the same ones that I've been hearing from, Neri, what they first and foremost prioritize is that the trigger for this war, as far as they're concerned, is the fact that between June of 2025, the end of the last war, Operation Rising Lion, and the eve of this war, one night before, I think it was 28th of February when this war broke out, right. Iran had built 1,000 ballistic missiles. It fast-tracked its ballistic missile program. The missile estimates that we heard was that at the end of the previous war last year in June, they had 1,500 missiles, and then on the eve of this war, they had 2,500 missiles. That's 1,000 missiles that they built in the space of several months. And one of the things that gets lost, I think, in these discussions is the objective assessment of the intelligence community of this country that Iran's missile program, putting aside the nuclear program, the missile program on its own constitutes an existential threat, even with conventional warheads. And all we have to do is look at what happened at Bet Shemesh with the deadly attack, the one that got through, to understand that if Iran had fulfilled its plan to build 8,000 of these missiles, that's the official assessment that they wanted by next year, to build 8,000 of these, that is an existential threat. You don't need to add the nuclear program. Iran could try to flood our air defenses, no matter how good they are. They can always be saturated, and by pure quantity, they could sow such amounts of death and destruction in our city centers by simply saturating our air defenses that this would essentially constitute its own existential threat. And I think that was the trigger for the war. And as far as Israel is concerned, and especially the Israeli defense establishment, and everything else that we're hearing is coming on top of that. So that, if we're talking about creating order, in my mind, the Iranian missile program is the primary trigger for Israel's decision to go into action. Now, when you accept, if you accept that analysis, then everything else seems to fall into place. When you hear Secretary of State Marco Rubio say, look, the Israelis were going to attack anyway. We had to make a decision, are we going to join or not? Now it makes perfect sense. And when you hear all of the other commentary, it all falls into place once it becomes understood that Israel was going to strike one way or the other soon, either on its own or obviously with it very much wanted American participation in this war. But either way, Israel was on its way to a preemptive strike to take out the resurging Iranian missile program. Now, another thing worth pointing out is that this number, 2,500 missiles, was basically classified until the war. And in fact, I think it was during one of the briefings, our phone briefings now with the IDF spokesperson, when I asked him how many missiles does Iran now have, and he came back the next day with a precise answer. I think that's the first time we heard a precise answer.
Yeah. By the way, 2,500 missiles that can reach Israel, right? Medium or longer range missiles. They have thousands of other shorter range missiles that are now doing havoc, especially in the Gulf.
100%. 100%. So that's the foundation for the trigger. And this is why the Israeli Air Force, the Israeli intelligence community, as far as they're concerned, this is the main thing. Now, obviously, what we're looking at is a very, very deeply planned operation. and there's no distinction being made between the missile program and other kinds of targets. So the opening strike, Neri, 200 Israeli Air Force jets, biggest flyover in Israeli military history, never before, of 200 jets taken off from bases in this country, turned into massive formations headed east, eliminated the head of the Islamic Republic, Ayatollah Khamenei, and 40 other senior Iranian leaders in two different locations in the space of 60 seconds. Opening strike. This is unprecedented. Another historical unprecedented situation is fighting a full-fledged war with the United States. Has never happened before. The U.S. is used to fighting in military coalitions. Israel is not. The last time, some people say it's never happened. I don't think that's true. It actually
1956,
exactly.
The Suez Crisis. Yeah. With the Brits and the French.
Correct. And that was actually very, very tightly coordinated, very, very detailed planning there. Each side was allocated a role. So there is a precedent, but not with the Americans, for sure.
Well, not with the Americans and the Israelis. The IDF has never done it before or since 1956. So we're going back 70 years.
Yeah, exactly. So look, and once the operation gets going, what we're seeing is the IDF focus on, I would say, three clusters of targets. The first is the missile program, and that in itself can be subdivided into many subcategories. You've got the missile launchers, the mobile launchers, and the stationary big missile bases, the underground bases, what they call the underground missile cities, which turned out to be, by the way, very vulnerable because Israel has learned how to target deep underground targets. And it's very surprising that Ayatollah Khamenei and his inner circle did not realize after the elimination of Hassan Nasrallah in his very deep bunker in Beirut that Israel can get to these leaders anywhere. They did not internalize the lesson. And the same is true of these deep underground missile launching bases, which have very large numbers of missiles. They became very vulnerable because Israel has figured out how to reach them. So you're seeing that kind of targeting. The mobile missile launchers, which is, I think, responsible for the majority of the missiles that we're now seeing. And, you've seen the videos. It's very surprising. Another gap between, even here in Israel, the public perception and what the military is putting out. I think not many people are aware that these trucks look like civilian trucks. They're driving down Iranian highways. When you look at them from above, from a drone, a bird's eye view, it looks like a large civilian truck. So you need very precise intelligence to know that these things open up, missiles come out of them, and then they continue driving like they're civilian vehicles. Sometimes they're accompanied by anti-aircraft missiles, surface to air, in order to make it hard for those aircraft that are hunting them. So that is systematically happening. At this point, on the 11th of March, when we're talking, the significant majority of Iran's missile launchers have been destroyed. Different numbers have been put out. You've heard the same numbers, 65%, 70%. I think it's clear that it's a majority. It's clear that it's a majority. And when you look at the data, even though we're still getting hit with missiles on a regular basis, the volleys are much smaller. The first 48 hours, we had dozens of missiles per day. Now, every volley is between 1 to 3 missiles. So even though they're trying to keep up the frequency, it's clear that their firing ability has been hit. The missile production, what we can call Iran's military-industrial complex, severely degraded. Thousands of missiles that were on the production line, fuel mixing facilities. The list just goes on and on across Iran, a huge country when we compare it to Israel, especially. From Tehran to Western Iran to Northern Iran. Very, very elaborate facilities for basically producing death and destruction on Israel's cities. This is what this was a missile death production network is being systematically targeted. And you've got the leadership. That's the second big category. So Ayatollah Khamenei all the way down to the chief of staff, the commander of the IRGC. Both of those, by the way, are replacements of replacements. So you're getting third-tier commanders who have been eliminated. Their predecessors and their predecessors were eliminated back in June. Now they're being eliminated. I think, by the way, that this is a huge statement by Israel to the Middle East, because the message here is, if you're planning to annihilate Israel, Israel is going to first find you and annihilate you wherever you are, whether it's in the depth of a bunker in Tehran or in Beirut. You're not safe. There's no immunity. I think that is a hugely important statement after October 7th. And it fits a much bigger pattern. Sinwar in Gaza, Lebanon, Iran, it doesn't matter. It's the same principle. And the third category, Neri, and this is actually the most intriguing, is the nuclear program. The nuclear program, at least to me, appears to have received the least amount of operational attention as of now. There was one secret site that was knocked out several days ago, where the scientists had basically, just outside of Tehran, had hoped that
Right.
and it didn't work. They were detected, and now everybody's asking what's going to happen with the enriched uranium, half of which appears to be under Isfahan, 200 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium, and another 200 kilograms appear to be divided between Fordow and Natanz. What's going to happen with that? We don't know. Got a lot of question marks swirling, but the nuclear program seems to have recovered the least. So the last thing I'll say is that, a lot of the personnel being targeted are not just senior military Iranian commanders. They're also besieged. There's clearly an attempt to destabilize the regime by targeting its internal repressive forces, the besieged, the police, the so-called national security forces, who are responsible for one of the greatest crimes against humanity in recent decades, killing 35,000 Iranians, according to reports back in January. There's clearly an attempt to destabilize the regime, and we're seeing especially those targets being hit in western Iran and Kurdish areas. So there's definitely an attempt to create conditions for the regime to fall, to hasten, to accelerate that. And a lot of the personnel being killed are also responsible for activating Hezbollah. We're seeing the Quds Force and the IRGC, what they call the Palestine Corps, which is responsible for activating, terrorists in both Lebanon and in the West Bank and in Gaza. We're seeing senior officers from those divisions being eliminated in both Iran and in Lebanon. So it's very interesting to see the transnational and really just complicated, very complex formations that Iran has built throughout this region that operate as a single entity from Tehran to Beirut to try and encircle us with a ring of fire. So it's extremely complicated, the enemy that we're facing here.
Extremely complicated, extremely dense, just thousands and thousands of targets across Iran. And like you said, not just in Iran. I liked how you broke down the various targets, Yaakov. Really, they're also, the list is almost endless, right? There's various command and control centers that keep popping up. Like you said, missile production sites, defense industrial complexes, fuel depots were hit this past weekend, fairly controversially, outside Tehran. And this is just the IDF. The other side of the ledger, like you said, the unprecedented historic partnership with the U.S. military, they're also going after, similar but also different targets. Obviously, the Iranian Navy is the primary target for the U.S. The beautiful armada sitting off the coast of Iran. Command and control bunkers, deep underground kind of missile production sites that are that the heavy U.S. bombers can get to, which are now flying fairly regularly. And also, it's super interesting to me that the IDF and the Americans have kind of divided the labor. So the IDF is in charge of Western Iran and Central Iran, and especially Tehran, right? That's kind of on the IDF, and the U.S. military is responsible for Iran's southern flank and the coast and the waters. So really interesting.
Although there have also been strikes that are 2,000 kilometers away from Israel in eastern Iran as well. But you're right. That is the general.
Yeah.
That is the general geo division of labor that appears to be surfacing. Yep.
Yeah. So really unprecedented, just campaign. I was gonna ask this. In terms of the pace and the scale of the operation, I've heard, and you've probably heard as well, the militaries are actually quite happy with the pace
Yep.
of the plan that they put together, and there really is a plan that was worked on together. That they're actually ahead of schedule now, 12 days in. Do you agree with that assessment? Have you heard the same? And by the way, how long do you think the joint plan calls for continuing the attacks?
I think that they are ahead of schedule. And, even just looking at the Israeli side that I've been focusing on and occasionally sort of raising my head to hear, what CENTCOM and the Pentagon and Pete Hegseth, Secretary of War, what they're updating on, when you factor that in, 5,000 targets, it's phenomenal. Now, really, I think we're at the total sort of edge of what air power and Navy power can accomplish. This is really never before has an operation struck so many targets and so far away, especially from Israel, which is conducting these operations from its own air bases. And it's not like the United States; it's not used to projecting air power at these distances. The last time we did this was only in June at scale. So this is unprecedented.
And by the way, the number of targets that Israel alone hit in the first couple of days of this war already surpassed all the targets that were hit during 12 days last June.
Right. Number of targets, number of munitions, and you have to wonder how this is being done, because it's not like the Air Force has grown. These are the same planes that we had half a year ago.
Well, there may be an added value here of the massive fleet of U.S. refuelers, the tankers sitting in Israel that are helping refuel.
100%, 100%. That's a major enabling component, no question about it. And also, I think the Israeli Air Force has always been adept at figuring out how to do new things with the same tools. And when I say the same tools, I mean physically the same tools. I don't mean necessarily other things. And what I mean by that is, for example, targeting. Okay, the number of targets and the ability to gather intelligence in real time and also to prepare targets ahead of time. Those are the two kinds of targets that intelligence always works with, right? You've got the target bank, which you prepare before, and you've got the real time targets that are detected, as you go, as you have friction with the enemy. Those two things are continuously improving, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that artificial intelligence is involved in this. There's just simply massive amounts of data coming into intelligence control centers here in Israel from every kind of sensor you can imagine, from satellite to space to radar to electronics. I'm sure that there's a lot of eavesdropping going on. We can all use our imagination, but it's way too much data for any human to go through. So I think we've got some cutting edge AI systems here that are able to turn this into actionable targets. Of course, there's always a person in the loop. And then how are they struck so efficiently? I think the fact that we have so many jets up in the air and they're working in this shift system, so there is always a formation over Iran that can respond to intelligence. And we've got the drones. The drones.
I was going to say, yeah.
That I happened to speak 3 days ago to a drone operator. He operates the Heron 1. It's known as Shuval in the Israeli Air Force, the 200th drone squadron, UAV squadron. They create this persistent coverage. So they gather intelligence. They're armed, of course, so they can respond to intelligence. You've really got some sort of symphony here that's playing, at scale and at efficiency that we've never seen before. So it's tactically, I think it's just hugely impressive. And I think you asked how long this is going to go on for, or what the operational timetable is. I think
Right.
that from everything, obviously, they're not sharing that with us because they don't want to give away too much. But I would speculate and say that based on everything I know from how the defense establishment here works, they have versions of the same operation. They have this sort of flexible planning. In other words, here are the core targets. These are the things we have to hit. These are the things that we can't compromise on. That's the missile program. That's the regime elimination, the ability to activate proxies, the command and control, the IRGC. The IRGC is the most important target. That's really, the heart of the beast. Everything that we've been fighting from October 7th until now, all of it leads back to the IRGC. So
the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps.
Revolutionary Guard Corps, the elite Iranian military, which in many ways controls the country, is the real power broker. If anybody has any doubts about that when the Iranian president was apologizing to his Gulf Arab countries for being attacked. A few minutes later, the IRGC fired missiles at the same Gulf Arab countries. And I don't think there's any clear demonstration of who is calling the shots right now in Iran. It's the IRGC. They've always had this alliance with the Ayatollahs, the clerical class, who set the grand strategy, the grand policies. But it's really in many ways the IRGC that's running this country, and they could tighten their grip. This is a whole different conversation. I don't know if you want to get into this, trying to figure out what's going to happen in Iran next, but the IRGC is the heart of the beast. I think these are red lines. I would call them core targets, the critical targets. Beyond that, there are targets that I think that we could categorize as nice to have. And the longer we go on, I think the more we're going to reach completion of the core targets. I don't think we're there yet, but I think in the next, I would say, guess 6 to 7 days at tops, the majority of the core targets will have been hit at this pace. And then I think we will reach targets that are still very good to hit, nice to have, but not necessarily deemed as core targets. And I do think there is a differentiation. And once the target bank starts to dwindle, I think we're going to see much more reliance on real-time targeting, which is more challenging because those are the ones that you have to detect in real time. That's essentially how I see it.
Yeah, I don't think we're in disagreement. I was told, and my colleagues and I reported in the Financial Times last week that the plan was, several weeks, right? At least in the Israeli minds, a multi-phase plan that has. I mean, we're definitely in now the third phase, or depending on who's counting, the second phase of the plan, where you're now really going after the regime targets. So the first phase was the decapitation, the initial opening strike, taking out Khamenei and several other dozen senior leaders. Second phase was the opening the air highway to Iran. Right. So you're going after air defenses, you're going after missile launchers and the like. You still are. By the way, the Americans are also focused on Iran's drone program, which is a major threat to the Gulf, much closer to Iran. And now the third phase that we're firmly in is you're going after core, like you said, regime targets. I assume, like you do, that this will likely take another week. And we'll get into timing issues later on, trust me. As we like to say on this podcast, the Donald Trump of it all. And I'll run a theory by you as well, the way I think of it. Okay, so this is how the war is going. This is probably at least how long it may last further, at least a week, maybe longer, but likely another week. Mm-hmm. On the other side of the battle, Iran, badly battered, but still, as you say in your neck of the woods, Yaakov, fair play to them. Still firing missiles and drones, not only at Israel, at what is it now, 11 other countries in addition to Israel.
Yeah,
ranging from Cyprus to Azerbaijan. There was even a missile that may or may not have been targeting Turkey, or maybe flying over Turkey. Saudi, UAE, Bahrain. I mean, it's everywhere. Qatar, Oman, by the way, who was trying to mediate. So they were firing on Oman. I mean, this is kind of the madman strategy. Although I think maybe I was in discussions with you or someone else on this podcast, it was fairly predictable they would lash out like this to make this as messy as possible. And they're still doing that. They're obviously still threatening shipping and the real choke point of the Strait of Hormuz in the Gulf. Now, the fact that this may have been predictable to some doesn't make it any less threatening. So, my question to you, Yaakov, how long do you think they can keep this up for?
So it's interesting that you describe this as a madman strategy, because I think that's exactly what this is. I've been saying for 11 days now that this is not crazy, that these are not crazy. It's not crazy. This is not impulsive. This is a plan that was hatched long before this war, and they know exactly what they're doing. The goal of the Iranians in doing this is to create a panicked anti-war lobby that will sit on the shoulder of President Trump, Gulf states that have considerable influence, and say, make this stop. Make this stop. Now, some people say, but this will destroy relations between Iran and the Gulf states. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. I don't know. It could well do that. It could well do that. But the Iranians are in survival mode. So they're saying, what does it matter if our relations are destroyed if we won't exist? We need to activate this so-called Samson option. I think it's completely calculated, and I think it's probably having some effect, just as the Iranians calculated. Some people think otherwise. Some people think it backfired, but I'm not sure that it has yet. I think it will in the future. They're going to pay a heavy price, I think, for doing this, but I think they're more than willing to pay it to ensure their survival. How long can they keep firing? Look, it's hard to tell. I mean, again, when we look at the graph, it's already decreased, but now it's stabilized. So my hunch is, and this was reinforced by my conversation with the Israeli Air Force drone operator who's flying, very very long missions, controlling his platform over Iran. He was optimistic, cautiously optimistic, that gradually, and he emphasized gradually, because when you talk to the professional operators, they stay very clear of promising things that are quick fixes. They're in the midst. They're the surgeons, so to speak. So I think they're a very good source of information. And what he was saying is
The
that
professionals.
yeah, the professionals who are in there in the surgery room, and what he said was that he thinks that gradually the rate of fire is going to decrease. And this is really simple math at the end of the day. The more launchers you hit, they can't produce launchers. They're in a state of war. Their military industries are largely wrecked. So every launcher you take off the table creates a new bottleneck. And I often when I talk to people about this, I compare the launchers to guns. You can have 10,000 bullets. If you have two guns, you're not firing 10,000 bullets at one time. Maybe you're firing 50. The
Right.
bottleneck is the launcher. It's the ability to send those missiles into the air. So I think that it's true. The longer this goes on, they're going to struggle to fire. They did disperse these launchers all over Iran, and they hid them because they had the contingency planning, foresight to do that. This is they invented in many ways the concept of a terror army, of embedding offensive capabilities in civilian areas, of camouflaging them. It's very interesting, by the way. The drone operator that I spoke to said many of the things that he sees from above remind him of the same doctrine that he faced when he was taking on Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon. It's the same doctrine. The IRGC is the I would say the copywriter of this doctrine. They are the ones who exported it to their proxies, and now
Yeah.
we're seeing it in Iran. The same scenes that we saw in Lebanon and Gaza, using hospitals, using schools, using civilian areas, bunkers, launchers embedded in these areas, camouflaged, asymmetrical warfare. A state is now employing these tactics. So it's going to take time, but I think time is not on the side of the Iranians. But I don't think necessarily we're going to reach a phase where they'll have zero firing. We might reach it. I'm not ruling it out, but I think it'll be decreased and reduced, but it may still continue sporadically until the end of the war.
Yeah, we'll get into the timing issue in just a second. It's crucial. I was struck, you probably saw it like I did. There was a statement that came out of U.S. Central Command, so basically CENTCOM, the U.S. Command HQ responsible for the Middle East. They put out a statement. Basically, it could have been a copy paste of an IDF statement about, like you said, fighting Hamas or Hezbollah, where CENTCOM said, "Hey, we're going after these launchers and drone launching points as well that are embedded in schools, in hospitals,
Right.
in civilian areas in Iran."
In Iran, right.
And this is something the IDF has said for years, if not decades, fighting those various terror armies. And also CENTCOM went on to add that they're firing these missiles and drones at civilian areas. So a double war crime as far as CENTCOM was concerned. Literally a copy-paste of what the IDF has been saying, only now it came from the Americans.
Yeah,
so quite
because
remarkable.
it's a copy-paste of the IRGC's own doctrine that the IDF was facing in Hamas, in Gaza and Lebanon.
Yeah. And also it shows you the kind of, as someone put it to me, I'm actually writing a piece about the U.S. Israel war fighting in this campaign, and the historic and unprecedented nature of it. As one person told me for this article, there's almost a mind melt between the U.S. and Israel, especially in the kind of security echelon and amongst the military professionals. So maybe an Israeli wrote that statement. No, I'm kidding. Obviously, an AI wrote that statement because it's 2026.
Israel Policy Forum is a policy organization rooted in the Jewish community. Our mission is to build support for a secure, Jewish, democratic Israel through a viable resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, advancing pragmatic U.S. policy towards the conflict, U.S.-Israel relations, and regional diplomacy among policymakers and community leaders. We promote policy measures endorsed by credible security experts, develop analysis and commentary, and convene programs that engage and educate leaders across the political, denominational, and generational spectrums. Our Young Professionals initiative, IPF at Teed, works to elevate the discourse among next-generation leaders by building community and facilitating engaging programs related to Israeli-Palestinian affairs. To learn more about our work, visit us online at israelpolicyforum.org and follow us on social media. If you rely on Israel Policy Forum for credible and nuanced analysis, please make a tax-deductible gift today at ipf.li/supportthepod or at the Support the Show link in the show notes.
Yaakov, in terms of staying power and the other front closer to home, the most beautiful front here in Israel, we talked about the kind of mood music and just the vibes outside on the streets right now. Is your sense that the public is still very supportive and behind this war effort? We obviously saw polling last week, 60, 70, 80% of the public, especially the Jewish Israeli public, in favor of the war. Do you sense that is still true and that the Israeli public has the stamina and the staying power to see this through however long it takes?
Yeah, I think I saw an IDI poll last week that said 90-something% of the Jewish population and 80% of the overall population and a quarter of the Arab Israeli population. I suspect, by the way, that it's higher because Arab Israelis are facing the same missile threats that everybody else is. But yeah, it's very interesting, by the way, to compare that to the American situation where it's basically by party affiliation. If you're Democratic, you're against this war, 80% or so. And if you're a Republican, you're mostly in favor, unless you're on the isolationist MAGA fringe. So absolutely, I don't think that has changed. I think the Israeli home front, the Israeli civil society, the big majority of this is for the war because we experienced the missiles. We understand that we can't allow Iran to have thousands of these. We're after October 7th. We understand that the whole concept of allowing an enemy that is a religious fundamentalist adversary that does not operate on the same strategic calculations that we make, or even that the Soviets made, or even our former adversaries, the nationalist Arab countries. This is a different enemy, and we understood after October 7th that they cannot be allowed to build force. So I think that the majority of the Israeli population remains very much behind this war. There is a minority voice that appears to be opposed to it. It's pretty loud on X, and it's drawing a lot of return so-called fire. So there's some very intense discussions that you're probably seeing as well. I think this is a very much a minority voice that's making a lot of noise. I think that there is good staying power. Now, the thing is that, like every war, because this is a standoff war, essentially, this is about using long-range firepower. There's a limit to everything. And of course, the Israeli home front is not going to want to remain in this condition for months or weeks upon weeks. I think that, this is obviously, it still carries a cost, even if there's a lot of resilience. So I think that the defense establishment is factoring that in when it makes its advice to the political echelon, to the cabinet, to Prime Minister Netanyahu. I think the assessment is the home front is doing well. But three dots, we don't want this to go on forever. We don't want a very long war. I think there is an understanding. Also, of course, you have the whole, economic consideration, which can't be ignored. If you want to have a strong military, you need a strong economy to pay for it. So all of this has to be factored in. But as of now, I would say majority of the population behind the war effort. It's pretty much a mainstream. I won't say universal. It's not universal, but it's mainstream. And I would say that the resilience is high. And also there is a lot of faith, I would say, in two things. One is the air defense system. There's still a lot of faith in the air defense system. We're seeing it has improved, by the way. It's clearly, from my own observations, the performance has improved from the June war. And also, I think there's a lot of faith in the Air Force, in the offensive actions that are being taken. People have the faith has been restored, I would say, from the crisis of October 7th. So so far, so good, I would say.
Agree with all of that, and I think you should add a third dimension to what gives people here succor and kind of staying power. America. Israel is fighting alongside America, and that's not a minor thing.
No,
at all.
No,
not a minor thing at all. And yes, despite the fact that there is some normalcy that has returned, especially since the opening days of the war last week, schools are still closed, which is very difficult for many people. A lot of businesses are still closed. Some have reopened. So obviously, both kind of economically and socially, this is far and away not normal. Especially, and we should now touch on the other front in this, a secondary front, but very, very active, and that's the northern Israel, with Lebanon and really Hezbollah in Lebanon. If we were having this conversation in northern Israel at the moment, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation in northern Israel because they're under constant rocket and drone fire from Hezbollah. And also, by the way, from Iran as well. So a real kind of war footing in the north. I want to ask you, Yaakov, we've talked about this at length in previous episodes, but the front with Hezbollah was, shall we say, planned before this war with Iran. There was mood music even back in December that Israel was preparing some kind of offensive to go after Hezbollah and to, I guess, degrade Hezbollah further after the previous war that ended in a ceasefire in late 2024. Maybe wasn't getting the job done, kind of an active ceasefire. Israel still striking Hezbollah, but not to Israeli minds enough. And Hezbollah essentially walked into this Israeli trap Monday night and into Tuesday morning. Hezbollah fired several rockets at northern Israel, including Haifa, after the death of Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader in Iran, was confirmed. And that gave Israel a legitimate excuse, but legitimate nonetheless, to begin this kind of wave of airstrikes across Lebanon, including Beirut. They've pushed additional troops into the buffer zone in southern Lebanon. And now, again, talking on Wednesday, a more aggressive and a more expansive ground offensive is in the offing by the IDF in southern Lebanon. So I want to get your thoughts about this kind of obviously secondary front, but a front that, again, could even outlast the Iran front.
Yeah, it's very interesting because I think Hezbollah had no choice in terms of when I'm looking at it as part of a proxy of Iran. When the Iranians said, "You're getting involved now. This is what we built you for." I don't think the Secretary General Naim Qassem was going to turn around and say no. So I think once we go after, let's remember also that Ayatollah Khamenei is a religious figure. He's considered a holy figure by the Shiite fundamentalist axis. There's a religious significance here, and that's why I was pretty sure that Hezbollah was going to get involved. Now, it's very interesting when you hear the comments of Naim Qassem. He was almost saying, look, we only fired a small volley at Haifa. Why did, you didn't have to go to war? And I think this is, in many ways, representative of the new reality that Hezbollah is facing, which is intrinsically different from any reality it has known in the past. I think every direction that it looks at, Hezbollah, it's seeing something new. It's seeing a new Israel, an Israel that says, you can fire, two sets of small volleys at Haifa. As far as we're concerned, that's an act of war. There are no more equations. We don't differentiate between 3, 6, and 60 rockets. You fired on our biggest northern city. That's it. You have entered into this war. There's a very different approach here to the behavior of the adversary. And I think that if Hezbollah wasn't sure about that, it's now very, very sure. It already saw, as you said, during the ceasefire, which was basically Hezbollah violating it, not with firing, but with trying to rebuild and reconstitute its capabilities. And Israel was striking and enforcing the ceasefire every single day. It already understood that Israel had changed. But now I think it's very clear that Israel is making zero allowances for so-called equations. By the way, when I say equations, for those who may not be familiar with the local definition of that term, equations was how basically Hezbollah communicated its red lines to Israel and said, look, if you do this, we'll do that. So think twice. And there was constant communication between Israeli decision makers and Hezbollah because Israel had accepted the equation. And another way of saying that is that Israel was deterred by Hezbollah and not the other way around. That has completely changed, totally changed. And I think that that's very interesting. Now, regarding the war effort, the majority of the Air Force is still directed at Iran. I think it's a big majority of the resources, the aircraft, the assets are at Iran, and a minority of the Air Force is busy in Lebanon. You can divide it into southern Lebanon. The whole of southern Lebanon has been evacuated. This is pretty dramatic, right up until the Litani River. Hundreds of thousands of people. The civilian human shield has been stripped of Hezbollah. We got Beirut, especially Dahya, the southern area that's controlled by Hezbollah, also evacuated. Massive strikes, airstrikes going on there. And you've got the Bekaa Valley, in the east on the border with Syria. And when they look east, Hezbollah, what they're seeing is a whole different Syria. Instead of having an ally, the Assad regime, a member of the Shiite axis, they've got the Sunni al-Shara regime, who they've been fighting for years in Syria, trying to destroy in Idlib and across Syria, failing. And now these Sunni enemies of Hezbollah are in power. And they're making it very clear that they want to work with the Lebanese government. And that's the third change. The Lebanese government, even if it doesn't have a lot of power on the ground right now, it's still, the statements that it's making are unprecedented. They want to ban Hezbollah. Yep. They want to outlaw Hezbollah's military terrorist activities. I don't remember ever a Lebanese government saying that. And so when you look at these three changes, they've lost their political legitimacy except their own Shiite base. They've got a different Syria. They've got a different Israel. Hezbollah is isolated and it's growing weaker. And so what we're seeing also is an expanded buffer zone. Is this a new security strip? Not at the scale that we saw in the 80s and 90s, but significant numbers of Israeli forces have entered southern Lebanon to boost those 5 positions that the IDF had beforehand. So that does look like an expanded security zone, Neri. I don't know for how long that will be, but that's also a change. Put it all together, and I think Hezbollah is in trouble.
Yeah, it is a change. This was a well thought out offensive by Israel, albeit with the resource restraints of what Iran requires. If and when Iran ends, like I said, I have it on good authority that the offensive in Lebanon against Hezbollah won't end. I'm just I don't want to say two minds. I understand the logic and the reasoning behind going after Hezbollah right now. I'm just wondering whether it's almost a bridge too far, right? Not just in terms of resources, but also just in terms of what northern Israel can kind of take in, right? You have ballistic missiles coming in from Iran. You have constant fire from Lebanon and Hezbollah. Again, fair play to Hezbollah, but again, this is a shadow of what Hezbollah was prior to the fall of 2024 and the real IDF offensive, right? If the IDF had been striking the Dahia and Beirut like Israel is now over the past week, there would have been constant missile and rocket fire on Tel Aviv by Hezbollah.
Correct.
And that's not the case. Okay. I'm just wondering whether the Lebanon front could have been put on hold until the Iran front was finished.
I mean, look, there are always, contingencies and scenarios, but I think the decision, in my view, is ultimately correct because this is a big strategic opportunity to go after the two main threats. Hamas can no longer project power out of Gaza. It's still strong in Gaza, but it's not a threat outside of Gaza, and that has to be preserved. So what was left? We had Hezbollah, according to the Alma Center, where I'm a research associate, They had between 20 to 25,000 projectiles left. That's still, even though it's hugely reduced from their previous arsenal of 150,000, including mortars, etc. But that's still an arsenal that's unacceptable. And they were reconstituting their UAV program. The Rudwan force had cells running around southern Lebanon, so they couldn't do an invasion like they were planning before. They were planning their own October 7th against the Galilee, but they could still infiltrate. And so again, this is all part of the same lesson learning from October the 7th. Enemies who are jihadists cannot be allowed to build up force or be tolerated when they attack. And so I think that if Hezbollah would not have fired on Haifa, I don't think we would have seen the opening of this front. But the moment that decision by Hezbollah and Iran was made, I think that's when the cabinet, I don't think, had much of a dilemma. We've got the United States on side, and this is all part of the same big window of opportunity to strike down the capabilities of Iran and Hezbollah simultaneously. I don't know how long it's going to go on for. It's an interesting question about whether the northern arena will have a different timeline from Iran, or maybe not. Maybe they'll both come to a halt at the same time. I know that people are saying otherwise, but I think these things are very dynamic. So either way, the way I see it is there's an hourglass that has been flipped. Once President Trump got in front of a camera a couple days ago and said, this is going to be over soon, I think that represented an hourglass that became flipped. And primarily the Israeli Air Force, also the ground forces in southern Lebanon that have not launched a ground offensive. They've just beefed up the protective buffer zone for the northern communities, but they're doing sort of raids, in and out. But primarily the Air Force is now working against the countdown clock and striking as many capabilities as possible from Beirut to Tehran.
So that was a good segue, because last topic I wanted to discuss is really looking ahead and what we may see and what we may not see moving forward. I have a theory, Yaakov, I'll run it by you, that basically the key variables moving forward, it's basically competition between three different races, right? So you have the first race is between what we were talking about earlier, U.S. and Israeli air power versus Iran's remaining missile launchers, right? To kind of degrade and suppress the outgoing fire and to make things, well, not only better in Israel, but across the region. The second race is between basically the global economy and Iran's ability to project power out of its own borders and really mess things up, also including, by the way, in the Gulf, in the Strait of Hormuz. And yesterday we had reporting / threats about Iran potentially mining the strait, which would be a major escalation by Tehran. So that's the second race vis-a-vis the global economy. And then the final race, and maybe the important one, is the one you alluded to, which is Donald Trump's attention span and commitment to this campaign, and Iran's determination to make this a war of attrition. In other words, basically, Iran, in its own mind, doesn't have to win this war; it just needs to run out the clock. So that's how I try to kind of look at and explain to others what we're seeing, and what we may be looking at in the coming week, 2-3 weeks. Is that fair? Did I miss it? Did I leave anything out?
Well, I think that that's comprehensive, and maybe you want to throw into that the midterms that are coming up, and the whole American political arena, which is its own arena, and I think highly influential on Trump. But yeah, I think that's comprehensive. And look, I think that this is why I've been saying why I've been arguing that at the end of the day, when you look at this from a military perspective, the wars that we are looking at now, especially when we're talking about standoff, aerial, naval wars, primarily, this is what we're seeing. The real measure of achievement is weakening and crippling the adversary until they can no longer become a strategic threat that can project power and follow their jihadist ideology, and then preserving that in the long term. I think that needs to be the real definition of victory. And so people are very hung up, and rightly so, about whether the regime is going to fall, not going to fall. And I think that we have to be flexible and understand that bringing down a regime that's ruling over more than 90 million people and that has 2 million foot soldiers in the besieged is not something you can necessarily do overnight with air power, no matter how great your air power is. But the regime can be kept very, very weak and paralyzed. And I think that should be the main thing. And eventually we can work towards and contribute towards its downfall. Strangle it, cut it off economically, support the opposition, arm the opposition. I think it's a process, and we have to look at the whole thing, not through very short-term timetables, Western timetables. I sometimes, I know this is an expression that we've all heard: the instant coffee. The McDonald's timetables. We need to look at, I think, as process as a spectrum in which Iran grows continually weaker together with its proxies over time. That has to be the most important shift. And eventually, we have to believe that the arc of history is going to lead to its collapse. Whether that happens in 2 weeks or in 2 years, I don't think anybody can know. It's not a science. It's not something we can predict. So my hope is that this is a milestone as part of a much bigger process. And my hope is that people understand that we should measure this in terms of years and not in terms of days or hours.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, you're basically saying this is currently a war of degradation, right? You want to degrade, if not completely eliminate, Iran's missile program, definitely the nuclear program, and they need to find a solution to the highly enriched uranium, about 400 kilos, like you said. And then that will be, if I understand it correctly, good enough. And then you shift to both a containment strategy vis-a-vis Iran and mowing the grass, as the Israelis like to say, right? You kind of upkeep the degradation.
Upkeep the degradation. I wouldn't say containment, because containment may hint at something else, but I would talk about preserving the achievement, and that would look like, as you say, mowing the grass. Now that the grass is short, mowing the grass and keeping it short until one day the lawn changes. I think that's a realistic game plan, as long as we're not talking about a mass ground invasion of Iran, which obviously we're not. I think that's realistic, and that should be communicated to the American and to the Israeli public, so that they don't feel disappointed in case the regime survives at the end of the war, and they'll say, "Oh, this is a failure." I don't think that's the case.
So, but that's exactly the point, that this was not communicated publicly.
Agreed.
The goals, by the way, both from Washington and also Jerusalem, were quite aggressive, ambitious, bombastic, choose your adjective, at the start of this.
Yep.
The U.S. no longer even talks about regime change as a goal. They're strictly focused on missiles and drones and Navy and the like, sometimes nuclear as well. So there's already kind of a lowering of expectations coming from the U.S. side, which is a bit of a come down given the scale of this operation, the scale of this campaign. From the Israeli side, for what it's worth, Bibi Netanyahu is still talking about creating the conditions for toppling the regime, and that, another kind of war of, basically like last year's 12-day war, only on a bigger scale, there'll be a lot of disappointed Israelis.
Yep, 100%. And I think that's a mistake in communications, in adjusting expectations. Because, what if the regime survives, right, this war, but it remains very weak and it falls, let's say, in 12 months? So why is everybody disappointed? We don't know what's going to happen. We're entering into a huge cloud of uncertainty, but there are certain things that we can ensure. And if we communicate those realistic goals, which is keeping the adversary broken, paralyzed, weak, unable to rebuild its capabilities, and committed with an ironclad determination to act if intelligence indicates that they will, if we see them start to rebuild missile programs, this whole approach that I'm arguing in favor requires jets to go out and not wait until they build another 1,000 missiles. When they build another 50 missiles, they have to be bombed. If any activity is detected at the nuclear program, that requires immediate action. That's what this is based on, is keeping them paralyzed and broken and unable to recover until they fall one day, which I do believe that this regime is going to fall. I'm not one of the pessimists who thinks it's going to be with us in a generation. I think that the Iranian people will not, in the long term, accept this regime, but I think it's going to take time, and the conditions may take a considerable time until they mature. Primarily, arming the opposition is not something that I think can be done from today to tomorrow.
So you beat me to it, and this will actually have to be our final topic and our final question. there have been strong hints, that there is a fourth phase to this war and to this war plan, which deals less in F-35s and F-15s and more in the dark arts, the spooks, as they say, working in the shadows. I don't know, arming various kind of opposition and separatist groups inside Iran, maybe providing them with more. Oh, and we're almost done. And now
the Iranians are signaling. The Iranians are signaling.
The Iranians are signaling that this is over. So I guess our final point will be: I mean, do you believe that there's a fourth phase to this war?
So I've been having some intensive debates about this. I believe that there are efforts. I don't know if we can describe it as a phase, because a military plan has resources that you allocate towards achieving a clear goal, and you can quantify it. How many missile launches have we hit? How many do they have? You can really measure this, and that's the best kind of military plan, because it's quantifiable. You can see whether you're succeeding, if you're failing, what you need to adjust. Now, the other kind, what you're talking about, is not, I wouldn't call it a phase. I would call it an effort. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm in favor of that kind of policy as well. It's okay to try and attack a system without knowing how it's going to result. We don't need to have all of the information and know all the future, developments. It's perfectly fine to enter, I guess what the high-tech people call an agile game plan. And yes, I think that that's underway. I think there are efforts. You can see in the number of airstrikes that Israel conducted just in western Iran, in the Kurdish areas, targeting the besieged headquarters, dozens of these, trying to leave them without a base. And
in western Iran on the border with Iraq.
Right, exactly. And there have been too many reports for them to be a coincidence about Iranian Kurdish opposition forces who are already armed receiving more assistance. Okay, now there are also problems with this. The Iranian Kurds, are separatists. The mainstream opposition are not sympathetic to separatists. So you already have a tension there. And also, I'm skeptical about the ability of the Iranian Kurds to project power beyond their province. I don't think they can take on all of the besieged and get to the heart of Tehran. But if the regime starts losing control over parts of western Iran, and Western intelligence agencies and special units can set up, bases there and start arming not only the Kurds, but others, then that's good. It's worth trying. There's nothing wrong with trying. I just think we need to be realistic and not expect to know the results of these efforts immediately, or expect them to bring, down the regime overnight.
You have a very Middle Eastern analysis of all this, Yaakov, which is probably correct for a war in the Middle East. For the record, I'll go on the record before we get sirens likely from Iran. I do believe something is in the works for this fourth phase / effort, maybe involving Kurds, but maybe the Kurds are kind of a misdirection, red herring, but something maybe with various opposition groups and armed elements inside Iran that could be activated from the outside and also aided from the outside and maybe from the air. Remains to be seen. Likely won't start tomorrow, but we'll see what happens next week. With that, Yaakov, I'll let you go and take shelter. I promise we didn't plan this incoming missile barrage when we started recording, but I'll likely leave my camera on, so maybe it'll catch the sirens here in Tel Aviv. But I'll let you go and take shelter, Yaakov. So thank you as always. Stay safe. Okay, thanks again to Yaakov Lappin for his generous time and insights. Also, a special thanks to our producer, Jacob Gilman, our editor, Tracy Levy, and our assistant producer, Eden Jesselson, as always, and to all of you who support Israel Policy Forum's work. Do consider making a donation to Israel Policy Forum so we can keep being a credible source of analysis and ideas on issues such as these that we all care deeply about, including this podcast. And most importantly, thank you for listening. Please subscribe and spread the word. And most importantly, everyone watching, whether here in Israel or across the Middle East, be safe.